Hello everyone. Why bookstores aren't the same anymore. Now before we get started, if you would like to support this channel, my books are linked in the description section, and my latest book is titled The Ecstasy and the Ignominy. It is somewhat a combination between books like A Tale of Two Cities, Anna Karenina, A Little of Crime and Punishment. It has a very Shakespearean, Dickensian, Melvillian tone to it, so if you would like to support this channel, my books are linked in the description section. Now, what do I mean by bookstores aren't the same anymore? Well, I used to get an enormous amount of joy going to bookstores, and still do to a degree, but not as much anymore, really. They used to be the place where I could escape from everyday life, where I could actually be out, among people who at least theoretically enjoyed reading, although I don't know how much that is true anymore. And they were just a sacred, magical place. But now, of course, in bookstores, you have people who, I know at least in Barnes & Noble, who stay up front drinking coffee, and they never really even look at a book for the most part. And there are many reasons for that. Some of it is because bookstores have changed, but it's also because of how I've changed, I think, as well. Because when I first started out reading classics, there was a lot to offer in bookstores. But as I became more well-read, it got to the point where I started seeing less and less books that I wanted to pick up. In bookstores now, I essentially see the same few dozen classics that I've either already read or I at least own. And I don't really see a lot of new material. Therefore, when I go to bookstores, I often just look around and don't buy anything because I have everything that they have to offer, or everything that I'm at least interested in. And and that's why I'm very frustrated with corporate bookstores in particular, because their selections, once you've read past the surface level classics, are quite limited. It's very rare that I'll go into a bookstore and I'll find something that I haven't seen before, especially in corporate mainstream bookstores. And as a writer, of course, I need to read as much as possible so I can gain inspiration and experience that I can apply to my work. But it's difficult in bookstores to find unknown or underrated titles. It's difficult to find obscure titles, especially in corporate bookstores. Now, in independent bookstores, you will have more luck, especially independent bookstores that specialize in old books. Unfortunately, where I live in Kentucky, you don't really see a lot of that. You don't see a lot of independent, at least antique bookstores. Sometimes you'll see independent bookstores that sell mainstream books, but it's very rare to find antique bookstores. There aren't a lot in Kentucky, and so when I was in New England, it was a feast. They were everywhere. I loved going to New England for that reason. But where I live locally, no. In fact, my the town that's closest to me, the town I grew up in, it doesn't have a bookstore at all of any kind, actually. Going to bookstores have always been very rare has always been a rare treat for me because they're not close, many of them. What it does have, though, is what I would call a vendor's village, where I can go and I can sometimes find, and you might be surprised by this, rare book collections. Like I found this rare book collection from the 1920s, and this is a collection of Ibsen's plays. I never thought I would find a collection of Ibsen's plays at my local vendor's village, which is a thrift store. I've often found now that thrift stores are where you find rare books and obscure books. And underrated books. It's not bookstores. It's thrift stores. mainly because, ironically, thrift stores are places where people typically don't go to read. They're usually searching for junk, and therefore collections like this can sit on the shelf for years until you come across it. Thrift stores are hit or miss, though. Sometimes I'll go to a thrift store and I'll find nothing 5 times in a row, and then suddenly I'll discover something like this. And so thrift stores are where I've been finding a lot, not in mainstream corporate bookstores. And again, like I said, there aren't a lot of mainstream. There aren't a lot of antique bookstores where I live. It's just not something that I see a lot. And so anyway, but this has made it where if I go to a bookstore, I'm not very excited because I know that I'm not likely to find anything. And so that's one reason why I've become disillusioned with bookstores. Another reason is because bookstores have become far more focused on promoting things like, romantasy, where romance takes up half of the bookstore sometimes, to the exclusion of other books, and that's a change I don't like. Quite often, in bookstores, also, I have been finding more and more that the staff to be rude, not knowledgeable about books. Sometimes I've had experiences where the staff will come over and say, "Can I help you?" And I'll say, "No, thank you." And sometimes I'm just socially awkward and afraid to ask for help. And then sometimes I'll find, okay, I really can't find this on my own. I'll ask, and then the person won't be able to do any better than I did. Sometimes they won't even bother to go up and look it in the system. That's why I don't ask for help a lot, because I know that 9 times out of 10 they're not going to be able to help me. But like, for example, when I was in this bookstore in Florida a few months ago, and I wanted to know where I couldn't find Percy Shelley in the poetry section, so I asked this person. They said, "Well, if it isn't in the section, it isn't there." I'm thinking, are you going to look this up in the database? Do you have a database? Usually, you should at least check the database, because I was seeing poetry books in sections where they weren't supposed to be. And that's another thing, is that a lot of mainstream bookstores do not have a lot of poetry, especially romantic poetry. Sometimes even books that cater in academics, in academic writing, don't have a lot of it. And you should have a mainstream a poet like Percy Shelley in your store, but many of them don't, and that's another reason. Like, as I've moved on to more complex writing, to more complex poetry, I also have a harder time. So many bookstores simply do not have what I'm looking for in many cases, especially with classic writing. And again, that's made it where that they just do not feel. I do not feel the same magic. And also another thing, and this is something that is not new, what I'm about ready to say, but I also don't like the fact that bookstores are still behind the times when it comes to having more self-published books, because I think that bookstores are still caught and captured by the traditional publishing industry, where they'll only accept books that have been traditionally published, even though that is an outdated market now. Sometimes a local author might get a book in there if they're lucky, but beyond that, it's very difficult to get self-published books into bookstores, which means you're only reading a hand, like really just a small sample size of what's actually being written. And so that's another thing I don't like. And even then, when it comes to getting your book as a self-published author in a bookstore, it often depends on nepotism and who you know more than the merits of your actual book. And that's another thing I don't like about a lot of bookstores, is that a lot of them rely far more on nepotism and who you know than actual merit when it comes to who gets an author signing, who gets their book in in the store. A lot of it has absolutely nothing to do with merit. So I think bookstores are outdated and behind the times in that regard. And so anyway, I think that because bookstores have become so stagnant, that they often they're not actually presenting the latest in literature and in thought and in narrative, and that can create a culture that is completely stagnant. And I thought I would read to you this passage from my book, The Ecstasy and the Ignominy, which has to do with the character of Catherine, who's talking to the man she loves, Edward, but she's talking about her past and how important narrative is to the human condition. When she says, "Good evening, Mr. Compton. I often come here at sunset. There's something beautiful about the death of day, something almost elemental. The night is like a warm blanket that veils your imperfections, your impurities. It is the one time where the dreams of the world sing. I never thought about it that way. Few people do. They would rather bask in the lies of day. It's not how we live, Mr. Compton, that defines us. It's the stories we tell each other. The night tells us the most splendid of tales. For somnolence nourishes all passions, even ones considered blasphemous in the eyes of God." And what she's essentially saying here is that narrative shapes us. It gives our lives meaning. And quite often, bookstores will suppress, I think, literature that would be considered blasphemous in terms of society, culture, which is often self-published, but quite often bookstores won't publish that kind of literature, and therefore we end up becoming stagnant as a culture because bookstores are not currently presenting books and narratives that actually challenge society, that challenge the time period in which we live. And the best literature always does that. It does not acquiesce to the time, it transcends the time, and we are not being presented with that in traditional publishing or in bookstores, and that is why bookstores, at least to me, are not the same anymore. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Again, my books are linked in the description section, and until next time, goodbye.